Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Tokyo College Symposium on Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. I am Takeo Hoshi at Tokyo College and also at School of Economics, both in University of Tokyo here. And I will be moderating the discussion today. For some of the audience who are attending the Tokyo College event for the first time, let me say a few words about the Tokyo College. It's an organization within the University of Tokyo, created a couple of years ago to, quote, spark deeper public engagement with the university, end quote, under the slogan of, quote again, shaping a shared future together, end quote. So what we try to do at the Tokyo College is to share the ideas developed in academia with the rest of society, refine those together, and implement those together if they are a good idea. We thank the college president, Masashi Haneda, for making the symposium possible, and Yuki Terada, Yoshiko Takahira, and Lipin Dai at the Tokyo College for helping this event. Now, let's get the symposium started. Today's symposium features Professor Benjamin Friedman at Harvard University, who published a book titled Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. So the same title as the title of this symposium. And he published this book earlier this year, back in January, I believe. And I attended one of the first online book launch events for the book that was organized by the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., in the US. And I found it fascinating. So I asked Professor Friedman if he can talk about his book at Tokyo College. And he kindly agreed. So ideally, he would have visited Tokyo College in person, and we could be holding this symposium face to face. But given the circumstances, the online event is the best we could do. So sometime in the near future, I would like to, or we all would like to invite Professor Friedman to Tokyo College at the University of Tokyo. Professor Ben Friedman does not need any introduction. He's a very well-known economist and Willam Joseph Maier Professor of Political Economy at Harvard University. He has been a faculty member of Harvard University for almost half a century now. He has numerous academic work in economics, especially in the field of macroeconomics, which I study as well. But he also has several books that explore broader themes. And the latest book, the book we are talking about today, is one of them. In this book, he asks the question, where the main ideas in economic thinking comes from. He goes back to Adam Smith, as we will hear and discuss later. He discusses in the book how the religion influenced what we know today as economics. So with Professor Ben Friedman, we have two excellent scholars at the University of Tokyo today. One is Professor Shinji Nohara, a colleague of mine at School of Economics here. Shinji is an expert on Adam Smith. So he's an ideal person to comment on Professor Friedman's book. He also studies the development of economic thought in Japan. So I hope he will introduce a perspective from Japan on the discussion of religion and economics. The other discussant is Dr. Rory Schacter, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Tokyo College. Rory has a PhD in political science from Harvard and was a teaching assistant to Professor Friedman when Ben started the research on this book. So it's a remarkable coincidence. Rory studies the history of political philosophy and the Enlightenment, so he can further broaden the discussion by introducing politics into economics and religion, I hope. So I will first ask Ben to talk about the essence of the book in 25 minutes or so, which is of course not enough to cover everything in the book. So I tell you, the audience, you all should go out and buy the book and read it if you have not done so. Then I will invite Shinji to make some comments, followed by Rory. Then I open up for general discussion. If you have any questions or comments to anyone on the panel, please feel free to write those using the Q&A function of the Zoom that you can see at the bottom of your screen. I'll be looking at the Q&As and field some questions and ask the panel. One more thing before we start, one more housekeeping. At the end of the symposium, there will be a survey for the audience so that we can get your feedback on how well we have done. So please do not forget to do the survey at the end of this symposium. There will be a URL code on the screen that you can follow, and you can fill out the survey. I will remind you at the end of the symposium as well. So now let's get started. And we start from Professor Friedman. And Ben, I understand you have the slides to share. So if you can go ahead and share the slides, we can start discussing your book on religion and the rise of capitalism.
Well, I'm glad to do that. But first of all, let me thank you, Takeo, for that extremely warm introduction. It's always a pleasure when I get to visit at Todai. And I'm very sorry that I'm not with you in person this time. I look forward to my next visit in person, but I appreciate very much the invitation to come virtually and speak about my new book. And I'm very grateful to Professor Nohara and also to Professor Schacter for putting the time into reading the book and offering their commentary. This is my first time meeting Professor Nohara, so I'm very glad to do that. And as Takeo mentioned, Professor Schacter and I are old friends from his time as a distinguished graduate student here at Harvard. So let me try to share my screen and see if we can get the slides to come up. So thank you very much for having me to this distinguished symposium. As Professor Hoshi indicated, the title of my book is Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. And the question that I ask in this book is where our modern Western economics came from. I want to talk about where this line of thinking emerged and when and what caused it. And to be very specific, in the interest of focusing our conversation, what I have in mind in referring to modern Western economics is what economists typically call the first fundamental welfare theorem. And it is the proposition that individuals acting merely in their own self-interest with no altruism involved can, and under the right circumstances, which turn out to be a competitive market economy, will end up making not just themselves, but other people better off as well. Now, among economists today, this is just something that we accept and don't pay much attention to because it seems to us self-evident. But if we do pause and reflect on that proposition, it turns out to be a very fundamental piece of thinking and one that did not emerge on its own. So my question in the book and for this evening is where that line of thinking came from. Now, there are some standard answers. I will focus on two. The first answer is to point to Adam Smith and his great book of 1776, The Wealth of Nations. Donald Winch, alas, no longer with us, but I would say the greatest Adam Smith scholar of our lifetime, pointed to the Wealth of Nations as what he called the fountainhead of all of classical political economy. And then the second presumption is that because Adam Smith and David Hume and their other contemporaries who gave us this line of thinking were part of the Enlightenment, in particular the Scottish Enlightenment, it therefore follows that Smith and economics more generally were likewise products of the Enlightenment. And we normally take the Enlightenment as a movement away from notions of a God-centered universe toward what we in our modern vocabulary would call secular humanism, not a phrase they would have had then. And for this, I point to Nick Phillipson, alas, also no longer with us, but Phillipson, I think, wrote the best biography of Smith for people who are interested in learning about Smith's contribution. And in the book, Nick Phillipson pointed out that not just the Wealth of Nations, but the entire project in which Adam Smith was engaged was, as he put it, built on the foundations of the Enlightenment's quintessential assault on religion. And I don't think Nick thought that he was saying anything unusual when he wrote that. He was merely echoing the standard presumptions. Now, I'm going to accept presumption number one, as I'll make clear. I do think that Adam Smith's thinking, as embodied in the Wealth of Nations of 1776, is the crucial document for our subject, but I'm going to reject the second proposition. And instead, I'm going to argue that the Smithian revolution that gave us modern economics was enabled by what were at that time new and highly contentious and hotly contended lines of thinking in the English-speaking Protestant world in which Smith and Hume and their contemporaries lived. And as I will explain in a few moments, the piece of that new religious thinking that I argue played the most central role was the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism, and I'll explain what that means, turn away from predestinarian Calvinism toward what amounted to a more optimistic view of the human character and an expanded view of the possibilities for human choice, human action, human agency. So let me clear up one potential misunderstanding right at the beginning. I am not, repeat not, suggesting that any of this had to do with self-conscious intent by religiously committed individuals trying to bring their religious beliefs to bear on their scholarly work. People like Smith and Hume became international celebrities in their own lifetimes, and therefore we know a lot about them biographically, and it would be absurd to make that suggestion for either one of them. David Hume, for example, was a notorious skeptic. Many people, including me, think he was an atheist. If he wasn't an atheist, at the very least, he was an agnostic. But he was also contemptuous of all forms of organized religion. Hume used to refer to Church of England bishops as retainers to superstition. His great friend William Robertson, who was the head of the Church of Scotland, referred to him as a heathen. Smith was much more private about his personal religious commitments, but there's no evidence whatsoever, none, that Smith was a religiously committed person. So if that's not the story, what is the idea? For my explanation, I turn to the thinking of Einstein. Einstein famously had a concept which he thought of as the world view, built the Welt in Einstein's original German. Einstein wrote that scientific thought is a development of pre-scientific thought. And he went on in this vein. He says that each of us seeks to form some kind of a simplified image of the world or worldview, again, the Bild der Welt. Why do we do that? Because according to Einstein, the world is just too complicated. If we try to deal frontally with all of the world's complexity, we're never going to make progress. And so each of us has in mind this worldview of built de Welt. And interestingly, Einstein pointed not just to physical scientists, he pointed to, as you can see here, painters and poets, philosophers. Philosophers is important in this context because Smith was never an economist. The word didn't exist then. Smith was a moral philosopher. Well, am I on good ground in applying Einstein's concept to economists? Several of my predecessors in my own department at Harvard thought so. One was Joseph Schumpeter, who 70 years ago wrote perhaps the most famous book on the history of economic thought, history of economic analysis, in which Schumpeter argued that anytime an economist sits down to do his or her work, he or she already has in mind what Schumpeter called a pre-analytic vision. And incidentally, that capital V on vision is not mine. That's the way Schumpeter wrote it. And I think what Schumpeter meant by the pre-analytic vision is the same thing that Einstein meant by built de Welt, world view. My late colleague, whom I miss very much, my dear friend Ken Galbraith, wrote that economic ideas are always and intimately a product of their own time and place. And because of these religious developments, I'm going to argue that what we have as modern Western economics started off as a product of the time and the place in which Adam Smith and David Hume lived. Now, let me summarize very quickly in 3 propositions the transition in economic thinking. Again, economic in quotation marks because they didn't have the word yet. The transition that Smith gave us. First, if we look at what economic thinking was like as of, say, 1700, I would summarize it in 3 propositions. First, could individuals correctly perceive what was in their own self-interest to do in the economic sphere? And the answer was probably not. And that was the reason people thought it was important to run an economy on a top-down basis. The French had their mercantilist system. The English had lots of government-granted monopolies and so forth. Second, however, and even more important, even if individuals could understand what was in their own self-interest to do in the economic sphere, there was no presumption, none whatever, that their acting on it would make anybody other than themselves better off. So there was no notion whatsoever of what we call the first fundamental welfare theorem. And then third, for this reason, action in the economic sphere motivated by one's self-interest was morally opprobrious. The standard noun applied was that this was a vice. The standard adjective was that this was vicious behavior. If we come forward to 1790, I picked 1790 simply because that's the year in which Adam Smith died, the answers are very different. Could individuals correctly perceive their self-interest? Smith argued that mostly yes, they could when they acted as producers. Interestingly, Smith did not apply this proposition to people acting as consumers. In fact, The Wealth of Nations is full of scathing, contemptuous commentary on people's foolish and frivolous consumption choices, especially among the rich. But in the spirit of a careful theorist who doesn't want to assume anything stronger than what his theorem requires for proof, Smith understood that if he simply assumed this proposition for people's behavior as producers, that was sufficient. Second, and most importantly, Smith absolutely had the first fundamental welfare theorem. He understood and he explained in The Wealth of Nations how and why it is that acting on an individual's self-interest under the right conditions will make other people better off in addition to that person himself. And moreover, what The Wealth of Nations is all about is explaining that the right conditions consist of competitive markets and explaining how the competitive mechanism makes this so. And then finally, by the time we get to the Wealth of Nations, the whole vocabulary of vice and vicious is simply gone as applied to this kind of self-interested economic behavior. Those words do appear in the Wealth of Nations. They're frequently in the book, but never ever to refer to merely acting on your own self-interest. Now, to be clear, Smith did not create these ideas out of whole cloth. He had significant predecessors. I've listed a few here. In France, France is important because Smith lived in France for 2.5 years when he was first starting this project. And second, in England, much of Smith's work comments on the work of people like Mandeville and Butler and Tucker. So we have to confront the question of whether they deserve the credit instead. Maybe Professor Hoshi and I, instead of thinking of Adam Smith as the father of economics, should think of Bernard Mandeville or maybe Francois Quesnay or somebody like that. My answer to this question is absolutely no. And the reason is that these predecessors had no explanation for how this result came about. It's like a mathematician who can state a theorem but not prove it. In particular, none of these predecessors of Smith had any explicit awareness of the role of markets or the importance of the competitive market mechanism. And we might say, okay, they didn't have our explanation. Maybe they had some other explanation, but they didn't have that either. They had no explanation. And especially for a generation of intellectuals who had all been trained to think in terms of, in Newtonian terms of system and mechanism, this just wasn't going to work. Newton's great work, the Principia Mathematica, had been published in 1687. By the time Smith was an undergraduate in the 1730s, the book was part of the standard curriculum at all Scottish universities, also at Cambridge, not at Oxford. Maybe that's why Oxford lagged behind scientifically for so many decades. But these people were all trained as Newtonians, and therefore these non-systematic, non-mechanistic explanations weren't going to fly. So let's, before moving on, let's just summarize quickly Smith's argument. One, Smith believed that our desire for material gain is absolutely inborn in us, and therefore no more morally opprobrious than the fact that we have to eat or breathe. There's this marvelous passage in The Wealth of Nations in which Smith says that the desire to better our condition, is the way he puts it, to better our condition, comes with us from the womb and stays with us until the grave. And in between, there's scarcely an instant when it isn't operating on us. And of course, bettering our condition could mean lots of things, but Smith goes on immediately to make clear that he means better the desire to better our economic condition. Second, in The Wealth of Nations, Smith puts at the very center of the story the role of these competitively set wages and prices, and with a just strikingly Newtonian interpretation. When you go back and read the language, it really is striking how Newtonian the phrasing is. Smith could be talking about planets circling around the sun. Of course, he's not. He's talking about the economy being pushed to the right place. Third, he sees these competitive wages and prices as simply the outcome of interpersonal bargains in which the sellers are just trying to get as high a price as they can, including laborers, and where the wage is the price of labor, and including the buyers. So there's no altruism on either side. It's just these two-way bargains. And fourth, as a result, Smith sees this competitive mechanism as an example of the familiar Enlightenment principle of systematic, but nonetheless unintended and unforeseen consequences. When you take action in markets that makes me better off, you're not intending it, you're not foreseeing it, it just happens. And of course, this is the proposition that we identify as the invisible hand. It's sort of odd that we do, because Smith himself didn't attach much importance to the phrase, but that's the way it's come down to us. Here, for example, is the statue of Adam Smith that stands in the marketplace in Edinburgh. It's right across from where Smith's office was when he was a commissioner of the Board of Trade. There are lots of pieces of symbolism in the statue, but I would direct your attention to the hands. If you look at the left hand, you can see it clearly. If you look at the right hand, you cannot. And that's not just an artifact of the angle from which I took the picture. That's part of the intended symbolism. Represents the invisible hand. And for this reason, Smith is famously opposed to potential impediments to the market mechanism, like all of the monopolies existing in England during his lifetime. But I want to pause to point out that I think Smith has been very badly treated, especially in the United States, by political conservatives. Smith did not think of the competitive market mechanism as some hothouse, fragile flower that has to be defended at all costs against every possible infringement. He was impressed with the robustness of this mechanism. And for this reason, Smith was very prepared to support all sorts of policy interventions that we, of course, recognize as infringing on the competitive mechanism, because he thought there was a role for them. So to tick off a few, Smith was in favor of progressive income taxes. He was in favor of luxury taxes. He thought that people who were driven around in expensive carriages should have to pay a special tax on them. And he was clear that the revenue from the tax should go for alleviating poverty in the country. He was in favor of taxes on whiskey and distilleries. That's pretty bold for somebody who lives in Scotland. And he was in favor of much tighter regulation on banks than anything we've known in the United States during our lifetimes. Now, what is it that enabled Smith to reach this insight? I've already mentioned a few items, and I won't dwell on them. One, again, is their training in Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism. A second is that Smith was extremely well trained in Stoic philosophy. Stoic philosophy has a lot about the natural harmony of the universe, so that if you do something that makes me better off without intending it, and then I do something trying to make myself better off, but it ends up making you better off too, well, this sounds like harmony in the universe. They lived in what was becoming an increasingly commercial society. Smith was a very observant man. He lived in Paris, he lived in London, he lived in Glasgow, he lived in Edinburgh. And also in both of Smith's books, there is a lot of quite thoughtful introspection. To repeat, Smith was a moral philosopher and a very thoughtful one. But I'm going to argue that in addition to these four influences that are very well known and familiar, there is a fifth one that is widely overlooked, and that is the transition in religious thinking that was underway in the English-speaking Protestant world right at the time that we are talking about. So let me now be specific about what I mean by the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism. There are many elements of this change in religious thinking, but for our purposes, I'm simply going to emphasize three: one concerning human nature, one concerning human destiny, and one concerning human purpose. For purposes of human nature, Calvin famously emphasized what he called the total depravity of all individuals, stemming from the fact that we are descendants of Adam and Eve, who sinned in the Garden of Eden. Again, quoting Calvin, the idea is that humans are unable to distinguish good from bad, unable to do any good in the world. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists who were emerging at just this time thought that all individuals are born with an inherent goodness. The way Locke put it, Locke's famous metaphor was the candle of the Lord, meaning human reason. And Locke argued that each one of us is endowed with the candle of the Lord if we will only use it. In terms of human destiny, Christianity envisions an afterlife with some people treated to everlasting bliss and others treated to everlasting punishment. And it was an enormous concern to individual believers, whether they were in the saved or in the condemned category. Calvin preached that people are predestined, by which he meant that the choice of who is to be saved is made not only before the person is born, but before the world was even created. The decision had already been made for every individual. And therefore, of course, there is nothing that any human being can do, no choice the person can make, no action the person can take, that can have any causal influence whatsoever on this predestined decision of whether he or she is among the saved. Well, by contrast, the post-Calvinists believed that everybody is potentially eligible to be saved, and most important for this purposes, that the actions and the choices we take do matter. To put it in terms of the phrase famously used by John Tillotson, who was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed after the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, we are able to cooperate with the divine in achieving our salvation. And the third element has to do with why we are here in the first place. Calvin preached that the only reason humans are here is to glorify the divine. Calvin's famous phrase is that the entire universe is a theater of God's glory. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists believed that human happiness was also certainly a, and perhaps the, divinely intended purpose for our being here. Now, importantly, this debate was absolutely at its height in Scotland at the time of Smith and Hume's young adulthood, when they were forming what Einstein would have called their worldview, what my predecessor Schumpeter would have called their pre-analytic vision. This transition in religious thinking in the English-speaking Protestant world was a rolling affair. It was at its height in England in the latter half of the 17th century. It was at its height in Scotland in the first half of the 18th century, to repeat, when Smith and Hume were coming into young adulthood. And it was at its height in America in the latter half of the 18th century, which not coincidentally is when the founding fathers were creating our republic, but that's a different story. Now, given that Smith and Hume were not religious people, why would they have paid attention to all this? Why would this religious thinking have influenced their worldview or their Schumpeterian vision? I want to offer three reasons. The first is that they lived in a world in which religion was more central and important in a multidimensional way than anything we know in our society. All educational institutions were religious ones. It was important for patronage in politics. In 1707, the Scots had given up their status as an independent country, but they kept the independent Church of Scotland. And so there was religious politics in a way that there wasn't politics, and there was religious patronage in the way that there wasn't political patronage. Second, intellectual life was very integrated at that time in a way, again, that we don't know today. Think about university faculties and curriculum, for example. My university, Harvard, has a distinguished set of theologians and church historians. We keep them separate. They're not part of my faculty. We keep them separate in something called the Harvard Divinity School, and that's the pattern at American universities these days. It wasn't true in Smith's day. When Smith was a professor at the University of Glasgow, it was a small affair. Here is a listing of every professorship in the University of Glasgow when Smith taught there. Smith was the professor of moral philosophy, but right there on his faculty was a theologian, professor of divinity, and a church historian. Again, they weren't separated off into a separate divinity school. They were right on his faculty. Edinburgh and Glasgow were almost also famous for their intellectual life during the Enlightenment. They had all of these dining and debate societies. The most distinguished of these was called the Select Society. Smith and Hume were among the original 31 members of the Select Society. Here's a listing by profession of those 31 original members. Includes Smith, includes Hume, but second only to the lawyers, the next largest category of people and members in the Select Society were the Church of Scotland ministers, including their friend Robertson. And Robertson himself was a very interesting figure. Robertson was simultaneously the head of the Church of Scotland and the principal, in today's language, we would call him the president of the University of Edinburgh. You wouldn't see that happening today. And the third reason is simply the contentiousness of the religious debate at that time. These were ideas that men fought and died over. The 30 Years' War on the continent in the previous century, that was between the Catholics and the Protestants, was deadlier compared to the size of Europe's population than either World War I or World War II. The English Civil War, that was between different kinds of Protestants, was fought within the lifetime of Smith and Hume's grandparents. That was likewise deadly. And ongoing, even the Highland Rebellion, which was part over religious matters, that took place within Smith's young adulthood. The Highland Rebellion was 1745. Smith was only 22 years old. Some of the fighting took place right outside of Edinburgh. He could not possibly have failed to pay attention. And finally, and I think most importantly, as I've explained very briefly, there is this substantive coherence between the religious thinking of the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism with its more optimistic view of the human character, its more expansive view of the possibilities for human agency, coherence between that and the economic ideas that Smith and Hume gave us. So I believe these new religious ideas were very much part of the Einstein worldview, Schumpeterian vision that these people brought to their thinking that gave us modern economics. And in effect, what they were doing was secularizing the dominant religious thinking of their time and place, complete with its more benign view of the human character and its more expansive view of the possibilities for human choice and human agency. And although I don't have time to go into detail about economics today, I have a lot to say about it in the book, I think this religiously motivated economic thinking has survived the passing of the religious impulse that gave rise to it. Very few people today are interested in the Calvinist, post-Calvinist debate. But it is still true that economics is still all about human choices and possibilities. What is it that Professor Hoshi and I teach when we're in the classroom? We teach about the decisions to be made by households and firms. It's all about human choices and their possibilities. The first fundamental welfare theorem is still the absolute heart of our analytical apparatus. And I think if you scratch any economist today, you're going to get this more expansive and optimistic view of human agency that was Smith's and Hume's. And I think especially in America, this religious influence has resonated right down through the 2+ centuries since. In the latter half of the book, I talk a lot about the evolution of economics and the debate over economic policy and the role of government down through the 19th and the 20th centuries. And there I argue that the religious influence continued to be strong. And in the end of the book, I argue that it's still with us today, especially in the United States, especially in our public conversation about economic policy and in the views and the voting behavior of ordinary Americans. So let me conclude. Economics was, yes, and still is a product of the Enlightenment, but that does not mean that it has nothing to do with religion. And instead, I argue that the influence of religious thinking was and remains a very important part of that story. And I think in my country, anyway, this role of religious thinking continues to be very much at work, especially in our public conversation. So once again, Professor Hoshi, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to set forth my views. And Professor Nohara and Professor Schacter, thank you very much for sharing your insights with me. I very much appreciate it. So Takeo, the floor is back to you.
Okay, thank you, Ben, for clear and concise. Yes, you can stop sharing.
Let's see if I'll stop the share.
Yes.
There we go. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ben, for clear and concise introduction to your book. Now I'd like to invite Shinji to make his comment.
Thank you for your great and inspiring book. It's my pleasure and honor to be a commentator on Professor Friedman's Origin and Rise of Capitalism. And as a historian of economics, especially Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment and Japan, I comment on your book. And Professor Friedman's book is path-breaking and contributes to the studies of capitalism and religious origins of economics. Especially since Max Weber's Protestant ethics, the relationship between capitalism and religion has been studied. Many presuppose modernity as secular. In case of Weber, even though he saw the origins of capitalism as religious, he saw modern people not necessarily as religious. This book elucidates that religion has mattered even from economics and people's economic thinking in the 20th century. So this is very path-breaking. And also, second, this book elucidates how the Enlightenment thinking was religious. Many scholars regarded this Enlightenment thinkers as secular or turning point to secular age. Scholars such as Ernst Cassirer, The Philosophy of the Enlightenment, Ernest Mosner in Bishop Butler and the Age of Reason, and Charles Taylor in his The Secular Age, insisted that the Enlightenment thinkers held deism, which emphasized human reason as leading to the understanding of the divinity, and which led to the later secularized understanding of the world. So they saw the deism as a turning point to modernity. And on the other hand, scholars such as Carl Becker and John Robertson emphasize that religion mattered for the Enlightenment thinkers. In spite of that, it remains to be studied how the Enlightenment secular writings or writings not directly linked to the religious matters were religious or related to religion. This made clear how Christianity mattered for the Enlightenment economic thinking. More recently, scholars have come to focus on the religious origins of the Scottish Enlightenment. For instance, Thomas Arnott's The Moral Culture of the Scottish Enlightenment illustrated that the secular or non-religious writings of the Scottish Enlightenment, especially on moral matters, moral philosophy and moral human nature or morality, reflected religious culture of its age. As he argued, the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers were critical of natural religion and reason, They were skeptical of human reason, but tried to defend human morality, which was seen as a core religious faith. To defend moral human morality, they relied on human passions and sentiments. They emphasized passion and sentiments as important for morality. Although another did not focus on Hume and Smith, both Hume and Smith could be regarded as influenced from this line of thinking. And I think, in my view, Hume and Smith's focus on sentiments is important for the understanding of the rise of modernity. Since Plato and Aristotle, the intellect reason could be seen as a different from person to person. For instance, philosophers has very excellent intellect and different from the commoner's interest. Credit also the same thing, and common people was seen as having an inferior intellect, different from the philosophers and clerics. So, and this kind of hierarchical nature of the intellect influenced the understanding of the society or the understanding of the hierarchical worldview. And unlike this hierarchical view, Hobbes denied this hierarchical view of the intellect. And Hobbes saw reason as not different from person to person, and people has the same reason or intellect as Hobbes saw, and people could, but in spite of this modern nature of modern nature of human nature, Hobbes saw that people could not agree with each other because people have the same reason. So people did not agree with each other. So the people fought against each other and resulting in everybody's war for all. So and the same degree of reason of or the peoples having the same degree of reason resulted in the conflict of people. So this is a very paradox, I think. And when human Smith focused on sentiment, not reason, as motives of people, people have a similar function of sentiments. So this is important no matter who one was or whether philosophers, clerics, or commons, or no matter how the nationality or religious opinions are, everybody has sentiments, and everybody has similar function of sentiments. And this is unlike reason. Reason might be different from person to person due to the training. And so about sentiment, people have similar sentiment. So sentiments are universal. So I think this is universality of sentiments are very important for human Smith because unlike reason, people could share sentiments through sympathy. So because people could share sentiment, this this kind of nature did not result in conflicts. So so sentiments is people can share sentiments. So this is a very important nature of the harmonious nature of human nature, I think. This focus on sentiment is also path-breaking because this serves the path of modern moralist tradition. Maurice, Montaigne, and Pascal, Nicole, and Bell, Pierre Bell, and so on denied the superiority of reason or denied how excellent human reasons are, and worried how human beings were influenced by passions as leading to human depravity and social evils. For Smith, unlike this moral tradition, for Smith, through sympathy, people could share sentiments, not necessarily causing such evils. Of course, Smith sometimes focused on human evils caused by passions, but for Hume and Smith, sentiments and passions themselves are not necessarily evil. Uh, in addition, God gives in the before Hume and Smith, it was God who gives reason, and it was not necessarily sentiments, not necessarily sentiments are given by God. This sentiment, Hume Smith's emphasis on sentiments and the denial of the importance of reason could have religious implications. Smith could be seen as denying the importance of God giving reason, and man's nature deprives of superiority reason was not necessarily evil for Smith. In this sense, religious implications of his focus on sentiments remains to be studied. So why Smith focused on reason and focused on sentiments and denies the importance of reason? Hume Smith denies the importance of reason. This might have religious implications, I think. So it's a very important point, I think. So my question one is, how do you evaluate the function, passions, and sentiment in the formation of religious thinking of the Enlightenment thinkers? At least some Enlightenment thinkers, such as Hume and Smith, were not necessarily deistic or did not emphasize reason, but focused on passions and sentiments. Did their focus on passions and sentiments have the religious background, or how did the American economists evaluate passions and sentiment in regard of religious faith? This is my own concern. So, yes. And the second point is capitalism in case of Japan. As I'm preparing for writing a book on how possible historians of economics viewed capitalism, I pick up a case of Japanese economists to illustrate the relationship between religion and capitalism in non-Western society. Since the Westernization in later half of the 19th century, many Japanese intellectuals saw Christianity as a core of Western civilization. They thought that Japanese traditional religions, Shintoism and Buddhism, could not become the core of civilization. Shintoism has no canons, and Buddhism was too critical of the economic behavior. And the Japanese political leaders introduced a system with the Japanese emperor who was seen as the religious and political leader of the Japanese society. And in these circumstances, on the one hand, Christian religion did not spread so much, whereas many people in other westernized countries such as Korea became Christians. In Japan, only a few percentage of the population was Christian. So, and scholars discussed why many Japanese did not become Christian, even though Westernization. And this is very curious because immediately after the Westernization in the later half of the 19th century, many Christian missionaries came to Japan to teach and advertise Christianity. And even now, many Christian missionaries have their own universities and schools and hospitals, and so many Japanese universities, private universities and high schools and hospitals are Christian origins even now. So in spite of this enthusiastic advocacy of Christianity, only a few percentage of Japanese people are Christian. So this is one of the curious point of yes, I think. In spite of that, some became Christian in Japan. In case of economics, some became Christian socialists. For instance, when Sen Katayama stayed at America, he became Christian and became to believe in Christian socialism. When not only Katayama, but also other some Japanese Christians try to reform Japan or to solve the problem poverty in Japan, because in Japan and before the end of the World War II, many Japanese people suffer from poverty. So how to tackle with poverty was a very important question for Japanese people. So, and the intellectuals turned to socialism. And then some of them are Christians. And Christianity was related to the rise of socialist movement in Japan. Not only socialist, but some non-socialist economics in Japan also became economists also became Christian. Hisao Otsuka became a Christian. As a Christian, he was interested in the religious origins of capitalism and studied Max Weber and translated Weber's Protestant ethics. And he was an economic historian who studies the ways of capitalism from the mercantile age to the present. And when characterizing capitalism, he was interested in the religious origins of the capitalism. So many Japanese intellectuals, such as Hiroshi Mizuta and social historian, and studied religious origins of the Western civilization and compared it with Japanese one. Then they sometimes emphasize that Japanese defeats such as hierarchical society were based on the situation that people and society did not fully have modern values such as human rights and equality, and that this situation was derived from the circumstances where Japan did not experience a struggle over the religion and church. As you know, Western society experienced a struggle over the religion and church and state. In fact, really political or secular power was who controls the power is a very fundamental topic for Western society. But Japan did not experience such struggle, so this resulted in the Japanese not fully modernized society, they think. So, and my question is, how do you think about the relationship in the region and non-Western capitalism? Do you suppose that the region also mattered for capitalism and economic thinking in non-Western countries? Anyways, thank you for your very inspiring book, Professor Friedman.
Hey, thank you, Shinji. So Shinji has two big questions, but before we ask Professor Friedman to respond to that, let me invite Rory to give his comment.
Great to be here. Takeo, thanks for inviting me to participate on this panel. And it's Shinji, it's nice to virtually meet you. And Ben, it's great to see you. As Takeo mentioned, I was a teaching assistant at Harvard in the economics department when a course of this title was launched by Ben. Economics 1776 it was called, which shows that there's no need for boring course titles. Anyway, I'm going to just offer three kind of general reflections, which are a little more theoretical, but then I wanted to ask sort of three questions at the end that I think the audience and all of us could keep in mind, even if we don't have time to address all of them. So my first reflection, let's call it, is that this is an excellent work, and I think my take as a student of political philosophy is that it actually demonstrates, without necessarily always explicitly making that its goal, that modern political philosophy, Smith especially, but ultimately I think Locke and Hume, founded modern economics. I mean, that's a stronger statement than one gets from the book, or maybe that, but that's sort of my gloss. And maybe that's self-serving because I'm a student of political philosophy, but let me just sort of follow up, the implications, at least in my view, of that. So again, I like very much what I would call the moderate revisionism of Ben's study, and the Enlightenment secularization story, I think, is too simplified. But on the other hand, I personally put a little emphasis a little bit differently, even though I have a lot of the same conclusions. Mainly that Ben is absolutely right, but I would say maybe even more right than he knows, in a way, that religion is the fundamental issue of the Enlightenment. And so unsurprisingly, the issue of religion informs the later history of the Enlightenment, including the rise of capitalism. And specifically, I think that the partial separation of religion and politics here includes economics, is really the accomplishment and the aim of the liberal Enlightenment. But the question really, which I'll just pose here, is whether the story really should not be one of the of the subterranean explicit or implicit critique of Christianity by atheists or by sort of pantheists and by some sincere liberal Christian reformers, and that if critique or even, let's say, attack on Christianity, even for the sake of some kind of reform, if that's the primary phenomenon of the launching of the Enlightenment, that would be different. I don't think completely different, but a little bit different than Ben's claims, which are a little bit more neutral about the influence or background context of Christianity, potentially. But this is a very contested sort of vexed historical question. My second reflection, and though kind of broadens this out, and this is really, I'm not an economist, everyone else on the panel is, so I feel free to raise the ambivalent status of economics or the market as an independent phenomenon. Certainly, it's an independent department at the University of Tokyo and elsewhere, but those are conventional, not theoretical truths. And so, one thing I think you could say reading this book, and I would encourage people to read this book for this reason, is that you realize that economics was originally political economy. I mean, that was even the term used. I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, and until I think the 1960s, the University of Toronto only had a department of political economy. They didn't divide political science and economics until later. But my main point would be that the political, broadly speaking, includes the problem of religion, and that it's only later modern and liberal thought which tries to make religion a specific private domain of society, which tries to make religion a private issue, so to speak, or a social issue, in the same way that it, in a way, tries to make economics a separate domain or a social issue. And so, the way I've summed this up is the ambivalent or semi-autonomous status of economics or the market could be seen as a product of the attempt by Smith and others, Montesquieu and Locke, I think, are the most important as well, to found a science of society suited for material progress and to overcome religiously induced political instability. So again, I think you have this issue that it may well be that economics itself is a product of this longer term attempt to make politics, let's say, safe from religion. So then that brings me to this reflection C, which again, I think Ben is well aware of this issue, but I would just, maybe for the purpose of the panel, emphasize it even more. What's the significance of Christianity, not merely religion, but of Christianity for the rise of capitalism? I've always found the word religion actually to be a strange term, because no serious religious person thinks of himself as primarily religious. They think of themselves as a Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist, etc. Religion is a sort of objective or external term, or a kind of Latin Roman term for regulation of order. So, Ben's story is really about the influence of Christianity, or is it, and again, I would raise it, or is it about the influence on Christianity, the reform, the weakening of it by people with non-theological motives? And so that just, I think we have to ask, and Shinji raised already this point, what therefore is unique about Christianity? I mean, first of all, you'd have to know what the essence of Christianity was. That's contested, but I think, speaking less controversially, it's monotheistic, but it lacks a civil law. And it makes a distinction between heavenly and worldly things, which obviously has direct political implications. And so you could say the Enlightenment or early modern political thought was an attempt to address this sort of unique problem that there was a complete contestation of authority between religious leaders and political leaders. Religious leaders could, of course, always appeal to the Pope, or they could, as John Locke likes to say, appeal to heaven. But when Locke says appeal to heaven, he means like, you're out of luck. You got a big problem. You don't. Locke tries to figure out a way to have a political order where you don't have to appeal to heaven that much. Pray whenever you try to order things so you're not stuck praying on your knees as much. But at any rate, this is a fundamental problem, and it later becomes, of course, in a way even worse, because you have Protestants and Catholics slaughtering each other. I think about half the population of what is modern day Germany died in the 30 Years' War. So, and my gloss on this, which is again too it's too broad probably, but is that Enlightenment liberalism, and I would include Adam Smith in this, replaces, you could say, the distinction between Christ and Caesar, or the heavenly and the worldly, with this new distinction between the state and society. And that this, of course, I think has a direct bearing on economics as a discipline or as a phenomenon, because the market, or market activity, so-called, belongs to society. And when we debate political economy today, what that tends to mean is what should be the relationship between the state and the market. And that presupposes this state-society distinction, which is not presupposed in pre-modern thought. And you could say is certainly not presupposed in Christian thought. After all, Jesus is the Lord wherever you may find yourself. So I would sort of highlight this issue of the uniqueness of Christianity. So anyway, I have three big questions, which I'll just have to leave on the table here, and I want to leave more time for discussion. And the first is sort of try to be provocative here. Was the later, and I mean 20th century founding of economics as a sort of separate discipline, formally independent of political economy, or political economy becomes a subfield of economics? Was that a mistake, so to speak, or is that something that needs to be rectified? The easy answer might be, sure, of course, we should pay attention to politics, but what could we go further? Is there some kind of fundamental limitation to the way most economists study economics? That is, they're specialized in economics, but is economics a specialized or a distinct realm? The second question is, and that you find this actually in Ben's study, and so I think he's sympathetic to this, but I emphasize it maybe, is democracy, small d democracy, and this is really Alexis de Tocqueville's view of democracy, is it maybe the fundamental cause of capitalism's development, and that even Christianity is, in a way, Christianity, according to Tocqueville, in a way produced the grounds for democracy, but is in a way democracy the fundamental phenomenon? And that would make kind of both religion and capitalism sort of dependent variables. And this reading kind of would highlight the distinctiveness of America, because America was the most democratic, or it was never really aristocratic in the original sense. And of course, in the United States, religion and democracy were in alliance. And eventually religion and capitalist liberalism, or liberal capitalism, were in alliance. Whereas in Europe, of course, religion and aristocracy thrown in altar were natural antagonists of democracy, or I'm thinking of the French Revolution here. So that leads to the third question, which has been raised as well, and I think is maybe the most pertinent for on this international panel, is I would phrase this: is the necessary implication of Ben's study, or studies like it, that there's always a fundamental dependence of economic development on background social beliefs, or sort of civil religion, and that not only is there a dependent on these background beliefs, but that more significantly, capitalism cannot generate these beliefs by itself? And so my example here, to put this as starkly as possible, self-interest is never a sufficient term, because interest is a controversial concept. And I can prove this, I believe, by simply stating that avoiding burning in hell, if you're a believing Christian, is, I think, rationally speaking, your highest interest, which completely outflanks any material welfare concerns you may have. And so, I would just close by saying, if we're looking at Japanese capitalism or Japanese economics, or for that matter, if we're looking about the rise of China, are we supposed to be looking for conscious or even unconscious beliefs or dogmas that support it? Is that sort of how it works? And they must be somewhere. Or, could it be that actually democracy, or democracy plus technology, is just so powerful that you don't need these beliefs as much anymore? Anyway, I leave it there, and thanks again for letting me be a part of this.
Thank you very much, Rory. And let me summarize the 5 questions asked by Shinji and Rory. Rory asked, first, identify the shift from political economy to economics, and he asked if this was a mistake or not. And the second question was he suggested democracy as the third factor in addition to religion and capitalism, and how did it influence or how did it interact with religion and capitalism. And the third question is whether religion or social belief, more in general, necessary for capitalism. And this relates to the second question of Shinji, which is in the non-Western capitalism, how is it related to the religion? And he has a very interesting story about Japan, where Christianity seems to have influenced the rise of socialism instead of capitalism in Japan. And finally, Shinji had a question about the role of passion and sentiment as opposed to reason in the development of economic thinking by Adam Smith. And in addition to these five, there's one question from the audience, actually one question from Professor Daisuke Arie, another expert on Adam Smith and the history of economic thought. And he asked, this is more of a clarifying question, I think. He asked, Hume and Smith were thought to be atheists or non-religious guys by their contemporaries, including not only the intellectuals like W. Robertson, but also ordinary people, according to most biographical works related to Hume and Smith. Were they all wrong? So Ben, you can pick the order of answering or responding to these questions, but go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Nohara and Professor Schacter, for those extremely insightful comments. And both of you were kind enough to provide me with the comments in advance, and I thought about them. And in addition to, I don't know how much time we want to take, but I have comments on your comments in addition to the fine questions that you posed. Let me begin, Takeo, if I may, with the question from the audience about whether the belief that Smith and Hume were not religious figures is wrong. I don't think that's wrong. I think that's right. My reading of Hume is that he is at very best an atheist. An agnostic, probably an atheist. There's one document he wrote that suggests the otherwise. Interestingly, all of the people of that era understood that Hume was the leading figure of the Scottish Enlightenment, but because of his religious views, he was never able to secure a university appointment. He was put up for professorships twice, and on one occasion, he wrote a very long document trying to justify his views on the subject. It's called A Letter to a Gentleman. Makes very interesting reading. It was never really published. It was published in a very obscure place, so it's hard to find, but I've read it. And I couldn't quite take it seriously, to tell you the truth. So my conclusion is yes, Hume is an atheist. Smith, as I said before, is much more private. He never wrote anything about this at all. We have a few hints. Smith was willing to show up at the Glasgow consistory and swear to the Westminster Confession. That's the key Calvinist confession of creedal statement in order to accept his professorship at the University of Glasgow. Interestingly, as part of the proceedings, he asked to be exempted from the requirement to begin each lecture with a prayer. His request was denied. And so he did begin each of his lectures with a prayer, but apparently it was always a very, very short one. So I would say there's no evidence of Smith's religious belief at all. All right, so I think the contemporaries were right. Now, let me proceed to these questions asked by Rory and by Shinji, and they're very good ones. So let me start with Rory's, and then I'll deal with Shinji's, and then I want to make a couple of comments on their very insightful remarks, other than in their question. First, on the relationship between economics and political philosophy, and in particular the separation of economics from what had been political economy. As Rory is well aware, together with my colleague Richard Tuck, I used to teach a course at Harvard, the title of which was The Origin of Economics in Political Philosophy. I think that's what we called it. And that's because Richard and I both agreed that that's where economics came from. And so I have no argument with this. Now, is it too late to rectify the departure of economics from political economy, which incidentally is not really 20th century, it was earlier. In the book, I date it to the 1880s. And the word economics became the standard word for our subject in 1890. Up until 1890, the best-selling textbooks all were called Principles of Political Economy, or Elements of Political Economy. Think of John Stuart Mill's book from the 1840s. In the United States, Richard T. Ely's book originally, earlier in the United States, Francis Whalen's book. I review all this in my historical account. But the key change was in 1890 with the first edition of Marshall's textbook. Marshall's textbook was not called Principles of Economics. It was Principles, it was not called Principles of Political Economy. It was called Principles of Economics. And incidentally, Takeo, as you pointed out, my title is at Harvard is I am the so-and-so and so-and-so professor of political economy. That's simply because it's the 19th century word for our subject. Well, is it too late to rectify this? Rory, I'm sorry, but my answer is yes. I think economics is too far gone down that road, and I think it's too late to rectify it. And from your remarks, I think you'll find this unsatisfying. The more we are aware of the intellectual origins of our subject, the better. I think that's, from the perspective of your commentary, that's weak soup, but there we are. And in my book, I have a nice quotation from Paul Samuelson, of all people, saying, with respect not just to economics, but science in general, that if you want truly to understand the science, you had better understand the intellectual and historical origins. And I put that in the book because I think it's right. Now, Rory's second question on democracy, I think, is spot on. As he indicated, I have a lot to say about Tocqueville. For those who don't know, Tocqueville visited America in the 1830s, very interesting era in our politics for reasons that I explain in the book. Tocqueville went home, he was a Frenchman, wrote a book called Democracy in America, and I talk about that a lot. And I think, Rory, you're quite right. Democracy is in my mind, a precondition for capitalism as we know it today. In my previous book, which was called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, I did a lot of speculating about the potential future of China and economic growth in China. And I didn't put it quite in this way, but in Rory, in reaction to your comment, I think if I were rewriting that book, I would. And the way I would put it in light of your comment is that Chinese communism has given them a different form of capitalism, very different from ours. And unless China evolves in the direction of a liberal small l democracy small d, I think they will be incapable of sustaining a form of capitalism that is much resembles ours. And who knows, they could invent something different. but since we've never seen it on that ground, in the absence of liberal democratic evolution, in that book I was and I remain skeptical about the development of Chinese capitalism. Now, as a historical matter, it isn't true that we got capitalism only in places where there was democracy. So, for example, I think Italy had a form of capitalism, but it didn't thrive. The places where Rory's point, which is just spot on, is that the places where democracy thrived are the where capitalism thrived, are the places where there was democracy. Now, finally, Rory's third question about whether some form of what he calls civil religion for us is a phrase popularized by the sociologist Robert Bellah, who incidentally had a fascinating book on religion and Japanese capitalism. Do people read that book these days in Japan? It's called Tokugawa Religion. Shinji, it looks as if you're reaching to pull the book down from your shelf or something like that. No, maybe not. Well,
I remember reading that when I was in college.
Yeah,
it was a classic.
Yes, Bob, who also is alas no longer with us, he was of the previous generation, one of the great American sociologists, started off at Harvard, then went to Berkeley, but his thesis, his PhD dissertation, written under the supervision of Talcott Parsons, who was then at Harvard, and as some people may know, was the translator of Weber into English. So Parsons translated Weber into English. Parsons supervised Bob Bellah's dissertation, and the dissertation was on the role of Tokugawa religion in fostering Japanese capitalism. But in separate work in the 1960s, Bellah created this notion of civil religion. It's very, very important work. And I think Rory was quite right. Some notion of civil religion, Rory, the way you put it in your question was civil religion or social beliefs, is very important to a capitalist society. And I have a nice quotation in the book from Kenneth Arrow, like Paul Samuelson, one of the great mathematical economists of our profession, in which Arrow says that no market economy can ever exist on the basis of self-interest alone. There must be a set of shared presumptions. Those could come from any of a variety of places, and this is why I think Rory's reference to civil religion is very important. But even Arrow said, you just can't have that. And incidentally, this is my answer to the question of whether Smith's two books have anything to do with one another. Many people say they don't. I say they do, because in the same way that Arrow argued that you can't have a market society without certain presumptions, Smith believed you couldn't have a market society without what Shinji is referring to as sentiments. People have sympathy, people have sentiments, people have a sense of one another. Smith believed that people, I mentioned before, Smith believed that people know what to do, what it's in their self-interest to do in order to function and thrive in a market economy when they function as producers. Well, as if I want to sell you something, I have to know or be able to intuit what it is that you want to buy. Well, how do I do that? It's through what Smith called sympathy. Sympathy doesn't mean the same as empathy. It means being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes by an act of the imagination. And it's only by my putting myself in your shoes that I have any understanding of what you might want to buy from me. So how do I know what to produce? It's only through sympathy. So Smith's first book absolutely goes with the second. Now I turn to the two central questions that Shinji pointed. And The first was about the role of passions and sentiments. Here, I've already been talking about sentiments and the extent to which they were religious in origin among the Enlightenment thinkers, and then the extent to which this might have been different among the American economists. I think is a very insightful question. My answer would be yes. The Enlightenment thinkers approached the question of sentiments from a religious background, but as I was saying before, not self-consciously. So for example, when I read David Hume's 1741 essay, I think it is, on avarice, I could just as well be reading Augustine from the late 4th and early 5th centuries, one of the great figures of the early Christian church. Now, would David Hume have self-consciously written an essay quoting Augustine? No, not a chance, I don't think. But again, part of his worldview, part of the cultural, or to put it in the words of my Harvard colleague, Jerry Holton, who wrote about Einstein. Holton, still living, I'm glad to say, is probably the leading living authority on Einstein's thought. Holton referred to this as the cultural soil in which a person grew up. Part of this cultural soil in which Hume and Smith and the others grew up was this deep immersion in the Christianity from which they emerged. And so while I don't think, I'm just giving this one example, I don't think Hume would have deliberately, self-consciously written an essay quoting Augustine. Could he have wound up being influenced by Augustine's thinking when he wrote about avarice? I think he was, you bet. Now, Shinji also asked about the Americans, and there the story is very different. And I'm at great pains to explain that in the latter part of the book. The American economists, people like Francis Wayland, John McVicker, Francis Bowen, John Bates Clark, Richard T. Ely, all of these people were self-consciously Christian. And in the latter years, they were self-consciously Christian socialists. So Shinji mentioned a person whom I didn't know. Is his name Sen
Katayama.
Yes, thank you. Sen Katayama, coming here and not only becoming a Christian, but becoming a socialist. That's absolutely par for the course at the time that he would have been here. There was this movement that people like John Bates Clark and Richard T. Ely called the social gospel. I have a whole chapter on that in the book. And it was in effect produced by a combination of these economic thinkers as well as clergymen like Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch. These were some of the great figures of the American clergy in those days. So the fact that Sen Katayama was influenced by them, again, just shows that he was paying attention while he's here. Now, the second of Shinji's two questions is, to me, really of the same form as the question that Rory asked. And it leads me to think especially about China. I think it would be very interesting for somebody, and it's not going to be me because I don't have the knowledge to do it, but I think it would be very interesting for somebody to write a book on Confucian influences on capitalism, and whether the kind of capitalism, and I'm especially interested in China for the obvious reasons, whether the kind of capitalist economic development that we're seeing in China now has identifiable origins in the Confucianism of the country's intellectual history. I would find that extremely interesting. And because of a hint that it does, and now reverting again to Rory's version of Shinji's question, I think even if China were to become more of a liberal democracy, my prediction is that their form of capitalism will not be identical to ours. because the underlying religious influences are different. So I'll stop there. And again, I thank Shinji and I thank Rory for these very, very insightful comments and questions. And Takeo, thank you again very much for inviting me. I'm honored to participate in this symposium, and my only regret is that I'm not seeing you in person.
Thank you, Ben. I still have some questions in Q&A queues, but we are running out of time. And so we need to wrap up. Maybe we need another symposium on the rise of Chinese capitalism or Japanese capitalism. It's too bad we don't have more time today, but we probably need to get together again. If we were doing this face-to-face at this point, I would ask the audience to give a big applause to all the panelists, Ben, Shinji, and Rory. I guess the audience can still do that. We can just cannot hear them. In any event, thank you for the great discussion. I hope the audience has found the discussion so intriguing that they go out and buy the book, which is available at your favorite online store, online bookstore. With that, let me end this symposium. At the end of the symposium, as I said, there will be a URL for a survey. So for the audience, please complete that survey. So thank you again for Ben, Shinji, and Rory for a great discussion.